Mark from Mustard Bikes here. We're in the workshop today with Triumph's Daytona 765 Moto2. We've got one of our products. We're going to run you through how to fit that start to finish. Now before we get started, I should say that this product fits all the 675 variants from about 2013 onwards. And you can find a better list of what it does and doesn't fit on our website. The process to install it is almost identical between all the models. There are a few slight differences at the start, but we'll run you through what they are. Now, to get started, we're going to need some tools. To get the job done, you'll need a 10mm and an 8mm socket. If you're using this product on a Moto2, you'll need a Torx T30 bit. In this case, we're using them with a T-bar, a small flat blade screwdriver, and then you'll also need a 5mm and a 3mm Allen key and a pair of side cutters. So to get started, on the Street Triple and the earlier Daytona versions, we'll first remove the pillion seat. But on the Moto2, we're going to have to remove the rider's seat. We're going to use the 5mm Allen key to do that, to remove the two bolts that are under the corners of the seat. With the seat removed, we need to remove these two bolts here, which are also with the 5mm Allen key. We can then pull back and slide off the rear cover or top cowling. With the top panel removed on the Moto2, we also need to remove this bracket. We do that with the T30 Torx bit by removing these 4 screws. Now if your bike's been fitted with the Triumph accessory alarm, we'll have to remove that as well, just by removing the bracket here. Again, in this case, we're using the 5mm Allen key. And that allows us to pull the alarm out of the way. So the rest of the process is pretty much similar across all the models. We're going to start by undoing the plug for the wiring in the rear fender, and then we're going to undo these 4 bolts that hold the rear fender to the bike. So we're going to start by taking our small flat blade screwdriver and just pushing down on this little top of the plug here and giving that a tug to undo it. Once that's undone, we take our 8mm socket or spanner and we undo these 4 bolts that hold the rear fender in place. Now once we get to this last bolt, just make sure that you're holding the rear fender as you undo it so that it doesn't drop out. And with that done, we should be able to gently pull away the rear fender, feed the wiring through, and we've got it removed from the bike. With the rear fender removed, we can now pull that apart and go and fit the indicators to the fender eliminator. To start off with, we're going to take this rubber and just sit it to the side so it doesn't get in our way. We then turn the fender upside down and we're going to start by removing this bolt here. We do that using a 3mm Allen key. Next, we need to get these crimp washers here off. We're going to do that with a pair of side cutters and just gently pry up the sides of these crimps. Once we've done that, we should be able to get a small flat blade screwdriver and just pry them off. And then obviously we do that on both sides. This then allows us to pull the reflector off, which gives us access to these 2 bolts here. We then use the 3mm Allen key and our 8mm socket to undo those 2 bolts. As you can see, we can then take that portion of the rear fender off. With that done, we need to undo the indicators by undoing these 2 bolts. And we do that with our 5mm Allen key. Lastly, to disassemble the rear fender, we need to gently pull the 2 halves aside. You'll see that they'll unclip, and that gives us access to the wiring inside. So now we have access to the wiring, we can undo all these plugs. These ones simply pull out, they're the indicators. And then this one here, we use a small flat blade screwdriver to push on this little tab here. And that will then allow us to disconnect that one. We can then remove the indicators and the wiring from the rear fender completely. Now we're ready to fit the indicators to the fender eliminator. I'm going to start by taking one of the indicators and feeding the wiring through this bigger hole here. Feed the wiring all the way through. And then we're going to take the original bolt, feed that through, and one of the M6 nylock nuts that are supplied in the kit, and do that up on that bolt. To do them up, you'll need a 5mm spanner and the 10mm socket. And then of course, we follow the same process with the indicator on the other side. So next, we're going to unravel this wire for the LED bolt. Now we did forget to mention a little bit earlier that when you connect the OEM plug, you need to match the black wire to the black wire on the plug and the red wire to the yellow wire on the plug. Since recording, we've sourced the OEM plug for this bike. We now pre-fit these to the product, making your product plug and play, no wiring required. So we're going to take all these wires and feed them through this large hole in the center here. I'm going to start with the indicators. And it's also worth mentioning you should feed these wires through here before fitting the OEM plug. And then we're going to fit the LED bolt wire through. We can then take one of the smaller cable ties that came in the kit. We're just going to run a cable tie around these 2 indicator wires. And then we take this one that's been pre-installed on the product, keep these wires all nice and tight in here, and do that one up as well. Once again, that'll just keep all the wiring up nice and neat and tucked out of the way. And we can then take our side cutters and trim the tails of those cable ties off. With that done, we're ready to fit the fender eliminator to the bike. To fit the fender eliminator to the bike, we're going to start by taking the base, and these little cuts through here, these profile cuts, go downwards. We're going to fit all the wiring through this oval hole here. And then you can also see we've refitted the rubber spacer, the standard Triumph spacer up here. We're then going to also take the wiring from this and feed them up through this hole here into the under tray. So we're just going to feed all those wires through there. It will take a little bit of fiddling. So we'll straighten this spacer up. And next we want to take one of the 35mm bolts that came from the kit and run that up through one of these holes. It doesn't really matter which hole you start with, just make sure that you get it through the corresponding hole in the spacer. And then we're going to feed that up. Just make sure that this rubber spacer is sitting correctly. Going to feed that up through the corresponding hole in the bike. So it's worth putting your finger in through the top here, just making sure there are a couple of little aluminium spacers there. Make sure they don't pop out. And then we're going to take an M6 nut and just thread that on top there. Once it's threaded on, the whole assembly will hang there. We can then take the remaining 3 bolts and 3 nuts from the kit and feed them through the last 3 holes. Again, just making sure that we get them all through the right positions and just keeping our fingers on top of those little spacers, Triumph spacers, to make sure they don't pop out. With all the bolts temporarily installed, we're just going to make sure that everything fits in nicely and that there's no fouling or wires being crimped. And we can then take our 4mm Allen key and our 10mm socket and do these bolts up. We're going to start with the one right at the back of the bike. We're just going to do it up till it's snug. And we're just going to move our way around. Once again, just doing it step by step to make sure that we're not actually breaking anything or snagging anything. Now, before we tighten everything off for the final time, we're just going to quickly check that everything's straight. Now's a good time that if it isn't, we can just undo those bolts a bit and wiggle it straight so that it's nice and square with the bike. This one's looking pretty good, so we're going to tighten everything off. Next, we need to take this middle section of the wiring harness and we can plug that back into the bike. And then we can refit the indicators. So the black wires go to the black wires. You'll also notice there is a green mark on these. And then the other side as well. And then of course we fit the LED bolt. You can see in this case we've used one of our special connectors that we have in house here. So we do that up. Now before we go any further, we're just going to quickly turn on the ignition. Check that the number plate light is lighting up correctly. If it isn't, you may need to swap those 2 wires from that OEM plug over. Then we're also going to check that our indicators are working for the correct sides. Of course, if they aren't, swap the wires over. The last thing to do before we start putting the bike together is just take this nest of wires. We're just going to coil it up and then use this cable tie from the kit to cable tie it all together so it's a bit neater. And then of course we take the side cutters and cut off the tag. At this point we can reinstall the alarm if you have one on your bike. Now if you have one of the other models of the 675 or 765, all you need to do now is put your seat back on. But in the case of the Moto2, we still need to fit this bracket and the top fairing, which we're going to quickly do now. With the bike all back together, all that remains is to fit the number plate and do one last check that all the indicators and lights are working correctly. It's a wise idea after you've been for a few rides, just go over everything, check that all the nuts and bolts are tight. Now, if you'd like to purchase our product and haven't already, mustardbikes.com is where it's available. Once you've fitted it, we'd love to hear from you on our socials, Facebook and Instagram. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video, and we wait till you see you next time.